About a year prior to me turning 18 in 2020, I received an offer from a acquaintance of mine who invited me to live in their home in the event that my home became more unstable or I simply needed a better place to live or any place to live. And I had the intention, just about every intention, of taking either them up on that offer or someone else who had given me an offer. I received a few around this time. I ended up going with theirs. And this wasn't too long after I turned 18. Like, it was pretty soon after. I just remember being terrified of the idea of my dad finding out that I was going prior to me actually having been gone. So I packed up some of my stuff and I messaged the friend of mine to meet me at the local Dollar General rather than at my home, because I didn't want there to be a conflict surrounding the fact that I was leaving. I didn't want anyone to know that I was leaving until I had already left, because I knew that there would be a huge argument and a lot of stress involved, and I didn't know what could happen because I had tried running away before in the past when I was underage, and the punishment levied at me for doing that was huge, and it really altered the dynamic for quite a while there. Of course, I was an adult by this point, and I had the full legal right to leave, but that did not change the way that I would ultimately be seen by my dad, and also by my mom, but she wasn't living with us at the time. So I wanted to be hush-hush about it. And so I got all my stuff together. I went out the back door, and I walked to the Dollar General to see my friend there, introduced myself, and we talked a little bit, but not too far into the ride, I was entirely silent. Like, I did not say a word. I didn't know how to say anything, because up to that point, I had been in my room for fucking years. Like, I had brief stints with public education, but I dropped out in 9th grade. I had briefly been a part of this, like, catch-up program for people who missed a lot of grades that let you do all of your work online, and you could actually do it from home. And this was before COVID, so that was a pretty novel idea. And so when I wasn't missing school, I was taking part in school in a way that allowed me to be at home. And I basically didn't do any work the whole time I was at home, but on paper it said I was at school, so it felt like a big W for me. Anyhow, I was in the car, and with no context on how to talk to people, and really no context on this person, like, we had never VC'd, we never really DM'd much. They were just kind of a fan of my channel, who was generous enough to provide me this opportunity, and so I took it. But, like, pretty soon my thoughts were entirely consumed by the fact that I wasn't talking and that I was supposed to be talking, and that freaked me out. And, like, all the time I had no idea what to talk about, what the approved subjects were, how to go about any of it. My mind would just go blank, which was really a terrifying thing in this brand new situation I was in, which was being in person with someone I never knew, someone I never talked to, and not having anything to say to them, not knowing what to say. It was just terrifying. And all the while, this was under the backdrop of me withdrawing from alcohol, because up to that point, I had been drinking really heavily every single day. I would drink when I would wake up. I would drink throughout the afternoon when I was in VCs with people, and I would drink to go to sleep. I was drinking constantly. And if you know anything about how alcohol withdrawal goes, especially when you were using it for what I was using it for, which was severe social anxiety, when you are getting off of it, the feelings of anxiety you were initially self-medicating for, they're going to be 100 times worse. So I was like shaking. I had to hide the fact that I was shaking so much around this new person who was totally safe, totally accepting, liked me. All of his roommates, which was an even worse debacle for me because I was just terrified to say anything to them, like anything, because I thought, oh, these are normal people, like I can't talk about my interests, I can't say anything, or I'm going to come off as not personable, I'm going to come off as autistic. Whenever I did try to say anything, I rambled over my words, like I just kept stumbling, and I was like, fuck, what do I do? I don't know what the fuck I'm supposed to say. And so, like, with one new person, it was already scary enough, but at least with them, I had the context to try to say things. Like, I knew that they were into my videos, which gave me a couple things I knew I could talk about because they liked my stuff. And if they liked my stuff, they liked some of the esoteric subjects I talked about. So I felt a little bit freer with them, but I still felt this like intuitive revulsion at myself for even engaging in these subjects with another person who is in front of me. And then when it got to these people who didn't know anything about me at all, I was just terrified. Like, I didn't know how I should present myself, what I should say, what I should omit. Zero context for the situation. Nowadays, when I'm around new people, I just say whatever the fuck I want, and I treat it as a kind of pleb filter. And people tend to really like that about me when I talk to them because they like a straight shooter who can just say whatever the fuck they want to say. That's a type of charisma that I did not understand at the time because I had it drilled into my head that you're supposed to be a certain way and say things a certain way. Like, I think the abuse that I experienced growing up, in tandem with the extreme state of isolation I was in throughout my whole childhood, created a unique lack of experience, and the experience that I did have was not applicable to the real world at all because it was social interactions with my family that were based on fear. And I had fear constantly of getting punished or being reprimanded for really basic things about myself that to any normal person would not be offensive. I thought those things would be. And so I was scared constantly, like I was shaking, convulsing. I felt this like ever-present adrenaline rush, and it, my heart was beating out of my chest at certain points because of it. I had these horrible tremors, and then with all of this physical stuff going on, trying to say something in the midst of that was extraordinarily difficult. I would say the wrong things. I would say things that sounded completely and utterly confused and awkward. It was a mess. It was just a mess. And that was assuming I said anything at all. Most of the time I didn't say anything at all. I was just completely quiet when I would be compelled to speak. So what I ended up doing was just staying in these people's attic, not talking to them at all, which is just about the rudest thing you could ever do. Like, you come to someone else's house, they invite you in, and then you just don't talk to them. Like, this is terrible. This is a terrible thing to do. But that's what I was doing. And, like, part of me, I mean, of course I've forgiven myself and I don't feel guilt over it per se, especially not at this late date, but, part of me, when I remember those actual events, I can't help but feel like a little like, oh, how could I do that to those nice people? Because they really were incredibly nice and accepting. And I just sort of blew them off out of my irrational fear. But, if I were to do a do-over of that situation, being the person I am now, and with the context that I have now, I think it would be a totally different ball game. And I think I would even really like those people, getting to know them more just from the vibe that I got. In addition to the fact that Like, I'm not transgender anymore, and I wasn't presenting. I was identifying as that at the time. Everybody there was super, super nice to me over that fact, even though I was majorly boy moding. I didn't have, like, anything about me that looked outwardly feminine, but I was intuitively uncomfortable with presenting as feminine at all. Like, even back then, like, I knew this is not me, this is not who I am, this is not how I want to be. And yet, I felt like I should do that for a number of reasons that I won't get into in this video. And so you combine the fact that I felt incredibly ashamed of looking the way that I did, yet saying that I was something else, and then having people adhere to those demands in spite of the fact that I put no effort into my presentation, and also the fact that I was just intuitively uncomfortable with the idea of being that other gender that I claimed I was. It was the perfect storm, really, because, like, I just felt so ashamed interacting, while claiming I was this transgender person that I was definitely not. And so I spent all of my time in that attic, and I was just wishing that I could drink. I mean, I wasn't even thinking about it for the vast majority of the time. I didn't have, like, the addict brain in that sense. I was dependent on alcohol and withdrawing from it, but I didn't have that kind of psychological addiction where you're just thinking about it all the time. I never really have, even when after that I ended up using it every day for like over a year. I never had that because it always intuitively just felt like a choice to me. But sometimes I'd think about it. Like, I remember once or twice I was like, yeah, if I could drink, it would make doing all of this a lot easier. But that wasn't an option for me. So I just kept withdrawing and staying up there in that attic, not eating a lot of the time too. Like, I had the option to eat many times and food that I was offered, and simply because I was so scared of talking to those people or being around them, I didn't. And I remember multiple times when they knocked on the door and came in, and then I pretended to be asleep because I didn't want to have to interact socially, and I sacrificed eating in order to not have to interact socially. I just laid there pretending to be asleep, and they thought I was asleep and then left. And I would message my friends about how hungry I was, but it was, they would tell me that I was basically starving myself, because I was. Like, I had the choice and the ability to go and get that food and to try to talk to those people, but in the midst of my severe anxiety, I just chose not to. And in retrospect, that was a bad choice, obviously. I think those experiences I could have had, it could have been like me leveling up, but what I was really afraid of was doing something really embarrassing and then vividly remembering it and punishing myself for it again and again thereafter. And oftentimes it doesn't even feel like I'm punishing myself for these things. Oftentimes it feels like my brain is punishing me. Because I will have already, for the most part, forgiven myself, but then I'll lie awake at night with all of these memories playing in my head like a compilation movie and torturing me in the process. And because I have such a good and vivid memory, it's always like stuff that other people wouldn't remember, but I do. And I didn't want that to happen more than it already did. And I was afraid that it would happen with these people, and that was part of why I stayed in there so much of the time, because it wasn't just an avoidance of being scared in those social situations, an avoidance of making a mistake in those social situations. It was also an avoidance of making new negative memories, and that was something I really, really did not want to do, because I know where that ends up with me. So I stayed in the attic, I pretended to sleep, I kept to myself, they built me a computer out of a bunch of spare parts they had, which is one of the nicest things anyone has ever done for me. It was a really nice machine. Eventually, I just started playing video games up there all the time. And that was basically all I did leading up to when I would end up going back home, because I asked to go back home. I made an ultimatum to my father and basically demanded like what I wanted to see changed about the environment in order to have me come back. He conceded to those demands. Of course, a lot of the stuff that I asked for him to do did not get done after I was there for like 2 days. But I thought that was good enough for me, the word. And there was also like a lot of emotional manipulation involved, I think. A lot of pressure and pushing, which is something I figured would happen and didn't want to happen if I were to talk to him in person about the issue. So it was all over the phone. I said I wanted to go back home, and that is what ultimately happened. They spent all that time working on their car so they could get me back home. And with like it, I really got to commend these people for how much effort they put in. Like, they were working nonstop on that vehicle and then used it to get me there, like just because I wanted to go back. And it was pretty incredible the amount of effort that was put in. But I get back and my dad is like whacked out on drugs talking to my friend there. And it's just kind of an uncomfortable situation for everyone involved. I didn't want them to have to see that. And I ended up getting a message afterwards like, "Are you gonna be all right?" And I was like, "Yeah." But the way back was funny because we listened to a lot of the Dick Show, and I finally started talking. And I actually seemed like myself. Like, I was talking about epistemology, philosophy, politics, science, drugs. I was talking about all these things that were super interesting to me. And like rattling off information. I was in my element. I was in my element because my special interests were brought up, and that made me so excited. Like, all of a sudden it was like all of my social anxiety dissipated. And I think partly as well because I knew that I was not coming back, and then it felt like there wasn't any standard that I was being held to. Because if you're living with someone and you see them every day, you don't want to make certain mistakes. In that environment, it didn't matter as much because I wasn't going to see that person every day. So once my special interests came up, like, it was like I lit up. I became a totally different person. And those were some really fun conversations we had on the road. But I get back to Kentucky from Virginia, and the rest is history. I tried multiple other times to leave home with varying degrees of success. I would say the most successful attempt was me going to Wyoming, and that was 2022, so that was 2 years after the whole Virginia fiasco. And I had learned quite a lot since then. I made a deliberate effort to become friends with the guy who helped me out to get to Wyoming, and I remember the drive there. It was like night and day because we were actually friends with each other and, at that point knew each other pretty well. And also the dynamic was just a lot different. Like, we got along a lot better. And so the journey there was so different. It felt like I learned so much since then. And it also helped that I was not withdrawing from alcohol at the time. I remember when I got back from Virginia, literally the first thing I did once I got into the house was go to the fridge and get vodka to drink. And I was drunk. I also had a bunch of caffeine on the way. And so I was having a good time. That was also the first time I had ever smoked any meth, and it was in efforts to stay awake, to wake my dad up for work the following morning. And that's a whole other story, but it wasn't this like chaotic, crazy experience. it felt a lot more normal than I thought it would. I'll say that. But it was quite the contrast to have those experiences immediately following that isolated, quiet, and unnerving, uncomfortable experience there in Virginia. Home Sweet Home came with a bit of a bang, I guess you could say. I was whacked out of my mind. That was the first thing I did when I got through that door. Then I called my friends, No Thank You, Dotesmite, and Princess Plunderphonics in the Discord that we were all in, and I talked through the whole experience and was basically like, yeah, I don't want to do that again. I just want to stay in my room and be a piece of shit, was more or less what I said. Only to then find out a couple days later that I had been approved for disability. And it was the happiest I had ever been. That was one of the happiest experiences still I've ever had, because there I had been getting treatment for various mental health conditions for years, going to mental hospitals multiple times. I had a long history of psychiatric problems, and then the government finally recognized the fact that I had all of those problems and was actually going to help me through having them. And so I could be unemployed, and I didn't have to worry about going hungry or being pushed out into a world I clearly was not ready for if those experiences in Virginia were any indication of my functionality as a person. And once I got that check, which by the way didn't go to me, it went to my dad, so he could care for me according to their terms and conditions, because the government considered me unfit to take care of my own money. But once I got it, I felt home free, I could be unemployed, and I didn't have to be so afraid, and I could actually work on becoming a functional person without jumping headfirst into the water with no prior experience and without a floaty or anything to keep my head above water.